Hi, everybody. Good morning and welcome to Data is Love. I'm super excited to have my friend and longtime co-conspirator, Fleur Larson, with me this morning to talk about something that I think has been kind of a contentious topic, right? Like who should get to do DE&I work and who should get paid to do DE&I work. So, welcome, Fleur. Can we just start with I want to hear from you. Like how did you get into this line of work? What was your
Mm-hmm.
journey to this moment?
Yeah. Well, first, thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me. It's super fun to get to be here to chat with you and connect with your folks. The long story short is I was a facilitator, got trained to be a facilitator back in college doing outdoor education. And that's where my love of working with groups and people and group dynamics really came to be, where I was trained to be a facilitator on ropes courses, which I don't always tell people because I know a lot of people have had bad experiences on ropes courses. So it's like, I don't want people to get horrible images of like being made to do silly games they don't want to do. But the world of experiential education and like what's happening with groups and how do we connect and how do we solve problems, that's kind of where I got that start. And my map to my values of social justice. I had jobs that had those two things where I got to do those two things together. And then when I decided to start my own business, part of that came because I wasn't able to find a job that I really wanted. And I was working for somebody else's company doing like business development, emotional intelligence, leadership combo facilitation. And, I would bring my values of of social justice, group dynamics. It's not just, oh, certain people happen to be quiet. Is it all the women and people of color that are quiet because the white men are taking over? Like mapping an analysis of systemic oppression onto group dynamics, right? And then I, started my business partly because of some colleagues asking or I guess I asked, how can I be of service? Like what, given my strengths, given my background, and I guess I should say my background's in education. So at the time I was working in mostly all nonprofits and in education. And those are two sectors and arenas that have a lot of white women. We're everywhere in those sectors, right? In
Mm-hmm.
those industries. Same thing in healthcare, right? Especially with nurses. So it was this
Yeah.
thing of like, that's my group. We're everywhere in those areas. How can I be of service around working with my group of people, white women, around racial equity, around social justice, around our role, how we are being harmful when we think we're being helpful, and then got feedback and information from other colleagues, both white folks and folks of color, about here's how I might be able to kind of position myself in a role, like a middle piece here, where I've been the harmful white lady, still make mistakes all the time. And is there a way I can work with my group around shifting how we show up? And so I started running my very first training and workshop that I ever did for free before, I was taking any paid clients, was The Privilege to Work for Pennies, How Martyrdom Undermines Equity. And that's when I was really very squarely still focused on nonprofits and education and healthcare. Like I now work across sectors and industries, but at that time I was still very focused on that because that's where I came from and that's where my understanding was. And that idea of I went up for a job, an organization we both know and love, Why We, and it was for their executive director job, of which I was sort of qualified, but like I actually didn't have a lot of fundraising experience, so I wouldn't be able to bring that to it. But anyway, someone who was older and had more experience, but was willing to take the low salary, got the job. And there's lots of other reasons why they got the job. They were very qualified, right? It was another white woman. And I was like, wait a minute, she's bringing the bar down for me to get into being a new ED. And it really clicked for me how when I've done that, when my martyrdom has actually undermined equity, when I've been willing to take a job that I was overqualified for but underpaid, so we're in nonprofit world with this, that I brought the bar down for when we know what we know about the gender wage gap around for women of color. And it was like, oh, that's really where my martyrdom is undermining equity. So that's how that kind of like first training and facilitation or work offering came to be. It was out of me seeing the role of where I'm at with this and kind of having some similar experiences, and evolving and morphing and being unsure. What is my role? Should I get paid for this? And should I not? Who should take money for this? Who's kind of like, who should get to do it? Who's like the onus, right? Who should actually be cleaning this up right? So especially with racial equity, if racism is a white people problem, like we're perpetuating it, we're benefiting from it, there's a role of us cleaning it up. And how do you do that in a way that's really accountable and directed by colleagues of color? Like those are all the questions that I've been, and trying to figure out what makes sense for the last few years around that. So I'll pause there. I know that was a mouthful of lots of.
Yeah, I remember that very first. I remember that very first offering, the privilege to work for pennies, and I think certainly for a lot of us that have come out of nonprofits, organizing spaces, it's been often a later in life realization that holy crap, right? Like there are people that are driving down wages that are, and simultaneously not advancing the mission, right? Yeah. Simultaneously not advancing outcomes. But okay, so this topic of like specifically in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, like who should get paid to do DEI, I'm curious, like you've been doing this work for a really long time, and I would even say like long before it was like desirable and sexy, like you've been doing it, and at the same time, like I love data, and one of the things that I've been trying to wrap my head around is when we look at practitioners in the field, it strike like there are a couple of like data points that really stand out to me. One is that like in North America, companies are spending somewhere in the neighborhood of $8 billion on diversity, equity, and inclusion. $8 billion. No one company is spending that. That spend breaks down in marketing and hiring and training and lots of different buckets, software tools, all kinds of things, right? So that's one, one data point that I'm like, $8 billion, like, we should be, it feels like it's a lot of money, right? We should be farther along. The second thing that I've been tracking is sort of the race and ethnicity makeup of chief diversity officers, because all of a sudden, I don't know about you, but to me, it feels like there's so many CDOs, like overnight. I'm like, where did they come from? Like, who are these people? And I found some data that I thought was really interesting, and it looks at the racial breakdown of CDOs over the last 10 years, and it hasn't changed. Even though I feel like I know so many Black and brown women that have that job, that the most common ethnicity among CDOs is white. 81% of all chief diversity officers are white, and that percentage has been consistent. Even though there's more CDOs in terms of ratio, it's still about 80%. And the gender split is about 50-50, a little more than 50% women. And that was also surprising to me. I'm like, who are these men? Like, I don't know that I've met that many men that are chief diversity officers. Either. Yeah. And so, I'm just curious, like, how has your thinking around who gets to do this work evolved in like the last, I don't know, 6-7 years that you've been doing this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, those numbers are so, it's always right. What's the story these numbers are telling? And I guess the most important thing is, here's how I kind of reconcile my role. And part of this is like being asked to do this is one huge thing. So I'm very clear. It's like, how can I be of service? Versus this is what I want to do, right? Like, and but how I be of service is very different than the martyrdom that I was coming from previously, right? So I've like had to work through that and shed martyrdom and righteousness, right? Like I've had to evolve out of those two kind of come froms. And one of the key things I think about is that I do think that if, racial justice explicitly, but, thinking about systemic oppression, is it needs to be directed by those most impacted. And that's what I wonder is that happening with those stats of who's doing this work with those white folks, right? And my hunch is probably not, right? Right? Like, so, and, there's the title, there's the professional advancement, there's the money, and all that is in question too. So could there be, and I do know some organizations where maybe it's a collaboration or, it's a partnership, right? It's a two-person role, a white person and a person of color, because there's quite a lot of like buffering and leveraging of gatekeeping that white folks could do as a strategic role, but in relationship with, a colleague of color or, a co-director of color, and really having to be directed by the folks most impacted. So that's a very different kind of like hierarchy of responsibility and accountability. I mean, that is what accountability looks like for me. It's really primarily in the form of a feedback loop, right? Like when we worked together, my attempts and made lots of mistakes at it, but like currently with Andrea Paul, who you had on last week, I really think about, I bring my full thinking to that collaboration with my partnership with her, because I also don't want to leave her to do all the work, right? So it's this interesting dance of like, I want to show up, I want to be of service. I've got thoughts, I have got, my full critical thinking, and I'm clear I'm going to follow her lead, right? And that is a different kind of tone and flavor of like how to come to this work than what I'm guessing some of these other white practitioners are doing. And, I don't know them. So
can I ask you, okay, what does it look like to follow the lead of the person of color, the person from an impacted group, and you're not leaving them to do all of the work? What is that? How does that actually play out? Because I'm sure there are like people that are listening in that are like, right?
But how?
What is that?
But how do you do
how does it? But how do you do
well,
that?
I think, and I'll just, keep speaking to my group for white women. And I do think there's a different kind of angle for white men, given the way sexism and patriarchy bolsters them up. So one of the key things for white women is don't go at it alone. I don't have to figure it out alone. I don't have to like go away and just like try my hardest to be like, what would Aparna want, and to like try to make, so when we start with relationship, then there's the opportunity for communication. So I can say, hey, what would make sense for me? I can ask you, ask you, hey, do you want me to do this? Do you want me to do that? And, but only when there's the relationship. So it's extractive when there's no relationship. It's tokenizing when there's no relationship. It's, and then here's the key thing is I actually have to go then do that. I have the follow through, right? Because we see information like, people doing surveys or wanting to hear from folks of color all the time about what would make the workplace better, but then nothing's done with that information. And so then people are like, I'm not telling you. So you actually have to like follow through. And that's where it really invited me to live in integrity. Like that's what's in it for me is like, oh, I get to like keep my word, right? I get to live in integrity, which means I say I want to have this relationship and follow the lead of my colleagues of color. So then I actually have to go do that, right? I can't be like, well, but I think this, and that doesn't mean I'm a doormat or I'm mute. Like I will share my thinking. And my rule of thumb is like, I'll share, well, here's what I think maybe once or twice. But then if you are like, well, no, I want this, I'll be like, okay, great. Then I will defer. And I don't feel bad about that. And, I used to have but I want to, I wanted to like have my own thoughts out there. And I don't have that need anymore because I also know that I'm smart and have good ideas. But you know what I mean? It's like, I'm not trying to like prove myself or be seen as smart in the way that I used to. So I had to like do a lot of personal work around when that would take over and make it so I wasn't really connected to you or to other colleagues. I wasn't really able to be grounded and actually really follow the lead. Does that make sense? Does that make sense?
I mean, it makes sense. There's so many things that are like, I think there's so many things that are swirling for me. And I'm just, I mean, there are two things that I'm thinking about. One, right, the need to, and I think that this is often true in early collaborations between white and non-white people, and I'm only going to speak from sort of kind of my point of view as a person of color, right, and not maybe some of the other identity groups where we can also extrapolate this out to. So
Mm-hmm.
the almost the competitiveness and the need to be seen and look smart in public spaces. Um, right, it's pretty intense, and I think people of color pick up on that really really fast,
Yeah.
and it feels almost like undermining. But the second thing that I'm thinking about, and this is something that you and I have talked about, I like at length all the time for the past decade, which is, and now there's like more public evidence for, we really only grow our equity skills and empathy when we're in close bonded relationship with people that are different than us. It does not happen. You can read every book and listen to every podcast, but it's in those bonded relationships that we have an opportunity
Mm-hmm.
to grow. And I'm just like, I'm curious, what, like, how that's like, how you've moved through that. And also like, how do you talk to your clients about this so that they're not off like wanting to be BFFs with like the one person of color in their organization?
Right. Yeah. Well, like with that specific thing, it's like who's being centered? Like their desire to be BFFs is what's being is what is getting centered versus what's the other person wanting, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, gosh, this brings up like all these other skill sets like emotional intelligence, self-awareness, it's like, and that is sometimes how I talk to white folks about it is like, here's all the other things we get to skill up around in order to
Mm-hmm.
truly show up in service, in order to actually have authentic, real relationships with colleagues of color. Is, I asked this in our training the other day, is like, do you know how people experience you? This was a group of white people. We were doing race-based caucusing, and that's how bias and privilege work. Is we don't know how other people are experiencing us, so we can say the same thing about men, right? Like, you mentioned other, there's
Yeah.
dynamics here that map to just, folks who are the oppressor or privilege, and those are on the receiving end. So these are dynamics that we're seeing with multiple identity groups, right? It's not just between white folks and folks of color. And so then of course, often the white men in the group really don't know how anybody experiences them. Like they're extra clueless. And even if
Yeah.
they're like the loveliest of people and like really good intentions. And that is like where they get to, and I'll just say, I get to grow as a human when I aim myself at racial equity, being fully committed, keep coming back after making mistakes, is I get my humanity back. I get to like know how people experience me. I get to have self-awareness. I get to actually have hard, make mistakes and see if we can come out the other end. And there's a
Mm-hmm.
closeness there. And I guess I'll just say this is, a little bit of a tangent, but I didn't know there was a closeness I was missing.
Mm-hmm.
And the more I have stuck it out or gone through making mistakes and, being in relationship, the closer and more authentic and actual, like real co-conspirator, real solidarity.
Yeah.
And I didn't know it would keep getting deeper, right? Like in the beginning it was like a banner, right? Like, this is what I believe, but there was a lacked depth, and I didn't know that, right? So that is partly what bias does, is like, you don't know what you don't know. And so the more you peel back the layers and the unlearning, then it's like, oh, that's what this is about. This is actually about liberation, not just like, platitudes or something. Have you
Okay,
seen?
speaking of, yeah, people are
Go.
like, give credit to people of
Mm-hmm,
color.
mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, and give and pay them,
Yeah. Yep.
right? I
Yeah.
think so much, I think so much of what I see happening is that like constantly, like my colleagues of color, especially other women of color, constantly being invited to give talks or constantly being
Mm-hmm.
invited to to do things, to pitch, to go through, you know, extra long processes and provide lots of
Right.
materials, which I can't but help but think that, like, I'm like, are you asking everybody for this much information or just me? And
Mm-hmm.
I'm, yeah, like, how do we manage the money side of this work? Because, you know, like $8 billion is no joke.
Yeah.
That's literally more money than Congress spends on free and reduced lunches, which, by the way, they don't because they canceled that program. Right? Like, that's more money than we spend as a country on
Yeah.
providing basic resources. Um, and we know it's not going to communities of color. So, as your practitioner, like, how have you negotiated referrals, collaborations,
Mm-hmm.
even talking with
Mm-hmm.
clients about what their budgets should be? Because I remember there was a time where, like, you were like, I'm just going to do the gig to build my portfolio. I'm going to take $500, right? Like, and I know that that's
Mm-hmm.
not true anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. There's four main things that I think about as a white person doing racial equity work in relationship with colleagues in color. And the fourth one, or one of them, is move money to move power. We know that that is just like got to be centered, right? Move money, move power in whatever way, whether it's referrals. So I'm always like trying to connect people to whoever, passing on clients, within a organization or company, white manager should always be thinking about like, what are the opportunities for advancement for the staff of color that they manage? Like it's got to be centered. It can't just be like happenstance, or if we happen to get to it, it's got to be, front and center, because that's, those numbers are huge. $8 billion. Where's it going? Who's it? Is it doing anything? Is it effective? Like, that's a whole nother conversation, right? And I think there are different models that I've worked with. Sometimes it's been where I do 60% of the work for 40% of the pay. And so the other, my colleague of color is getting more money and working less. So that's a way to think about like reparations of time and money in just in a business relationship. And so there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
different ways to kind of like that I've been experimenting or just trying that, and, curious what other people are doing. With clients, I recommend like, often white people are the problem and causing a lot of problem in these organizations, right? Their racism is unchecked. And so they want to bring me in, and I'll say, okay, if you're going to spend money on me, you have to have equal or more money being spent on your colleagues on the staff of color, right? So the budgets have to match or exceed. And, the folks of staff of color are going to maybe want something different, right? Or need something different, maybe just any old kind of
Mm-hmm.
professional development. But I'm here to work with the white folks on checking their bias and how they're showing up and stuff like that. So those are some examples of like being specific about where the money's going, and moving money to move power is just like, and then in my personal life, I only donate to POC led organizations. So that's one way I think about moving money, move power personally. So those are a couple of thoughts that I have about that. And being open about money. That's the other thing, is being, I had to face any stuff I had about talking about money. And I now am very open and relaxed about talking about money because of the role I play, and being able to help other folks be more open about money, where normally it's been kind of not talked about. And that actually is at the disadvantage of folks of color. Oh, I can't hear you. Oh, your mic's off.
Okay, so Fleur, what do you think companies should be thinking about when they go to hire an equity consultant? If they're focused on modifying, updating, trying to drive true impact from their DE&I programs?
Having a multiracial team is useful. I often will coach the white folks, partly so that my colleague of color doesn't have to continually be faced with all of the nonsense that comes at them. So that can be a useful thing, is to look for firms or practitioners who can work together, because often white folks and folks of color need different things. And then really thinking about, the money, like hiring folks of color to be speakers. And, there's if you want to listen to a Brene Brown thing or a Robin DiAngelo thing, but they have lots of their talks for free on the internet. You don't need to send your money to them, but like moving your money to folks of color for whether they're speakers or practitioners to help do work. So I think you can open your budget and look at what do you value and where's the money going. And that's one thing to really track. So those are two thoughts I have about that. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
I feel like there's a first time for everything, and
yeah.
wow, we need. I mean, oh my gosh, major technology fail this morning. Fleur, thank you for your patience, and thank you for everybody else as I figure out my computer just froze on me. It was like this conversation.
That's so hard, and you handled it well.
One thing that I wanted to ask you about is. And we've talked about this, and I think that there's got to be a way of shifting from the one-on-one to systems, which is this idea of repair. Because when we start doing race equity work, I think that a lot of it ends in hurt feelings, and budgets are taken away. People are disconnected, and so. Yeah, like how do we repair one-on-one, and how do we then scale it to our organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to part of repair, it might be one-on-one. It's also like what's been happening historically at the organization or company. And I think one key piece of repair might predate some of the people that are needing to do or that are in the position. Like some stuff was happening before I got here, but I'm also the one now in the role. And so I think seeing that, because people can, especially white folks, can take it so personally, like, well, I didn't do that, or I have good intentions, right? And that's just not useful at all. So I think there is a piece around repair and just healthy conflict, and being able to have conversations and actually receive information about yourself. My sense or experience now, though, is that folks of color are tired of sharing. Like, we've already told you about the impact. We're done telling you. It's actually emotionally exhaustive to keep telling you, right? So the need for implementation and follow-up, as Sunato is named, is that's really key. And some, white folks can be like, well, let's do a survey to get information. It's like, we actually probably already have all the information, including what's not being said. If people have stopped sharing, that's information for us. Like, oh. And so there's repair individually, collectively, and then systems. I think with the whole company, HR is a place that can happen. And I know Andrea really spoke to a lot of beautiful points and really powerful points about that last week. So it's like a left foot, right foot, people and policies. Like, we need to do both, and sometimes a little bit more of the other, and then circle back around. And ultimately, this is about change. We could just say this is about change, doing things different, and people have feelings about change. And folks with positional power, people at the top, white folks, men, they're going to have to change. And that's hard. That's really hard to do. But we're going to keep getting the results we're getting unless people do, right? Like, which is, you're going to have attrition. People are not going to stay. People are going to leave. And all of that will just keep happening. So then the cycle of, where is that $8 billion going? It's just like, can be a revolving door. And until we actually do different to get different.
Do different to get different. I want to wrap with sort of one last question, which is, you've been doing this work for a long time, and I think how you do this work has changed pretty dramatically from, like, let's say 7 years ago, from that very first workshop on martyrdom to this moment now. And I think you're also working in lots of different, you're working in nonprofits and higher ed and like private sector, lots of places. What has been like your one aha, like what's been the biggest learning in this time as a white woman practitioner in these, right?
Well, I think I've named some of them, but I'll just, I think for me personally, and then like there's for the bigger picture, the pieces for me personally is around like what I said. I didn't know there was a closeness or connection that was possible that I was missing. And that is, you know, kind of what oppression does. It disconnects us. Oppression divides us, even from ourselves and from each other. So really feeling that, not having it just be this like nice conceptual thing to say, but like for real. And why that's, you know, other than that being like useful for me to experience, it also makes it so I can stay in it. Like, oh, this is about actual connection. And so when things get hard, I don't just bow out, you know, like people, it can't just be you believe in it, your values, that's not enough. Like this will get too hard, especially if you make a public mistake, like in a meeting or, you know, especially as a white person, you know, one of the biggest things is I don't want to say the wrong thing. And I don't want anyone to be seen as racist. And even though, you know, everyone's got bias, so of course I have bias and racial bias, and therefore I have racism, right? Like, so I think that enables me to stay in it, even when I make some of the biggest mess ups. And that's been huge for me. And kind of being able to show other white folks, here's what's possible. This isn't just about learning the right thing to say. What's possible is like true solidarity and actual liberation, like my liberation as well. And not from a place of centering it or, you know, white feminism, but like actually in it with you to bring down all of this stuff.
And I think the added bonus is that like your kid gets to have a pretty diverse community of aunties and uncles. You know, I'm just, you know, like you and I see equity work very differently. And I think today, maybe for the very first time, I'm feeling like a sense of convergence or maybe even like that we're just doing it really differently. And what's coming up for me, you know, that I love data, and that's been a pretty significant orientation for me to do this work. And I've been preparing for a masterclass that I'm teaching over the next 2 days. And one of my slides says, workplace equity isn't just a math problem. It's often a human problem to solve for. And yeah, like without the relationships, without asking different questions, we don't get there. And we can ask those questions of our data. We can also ask those questions of our people and our organization. So that's just, yeah, it's just like, I'm like, oh man, like maybe we haven't been saying very different things all along. And this is like after knowing each other for a decade, right?
Yeah.
Well,
moment. And the truth is we need many approaches, right? We need many approaches, and some are needed more at one time than the other. You know, it's like, it's multi-pronged, creative. One of the Adrienne Maree Brown, I'll finish here, Adrienne Maree Brown quote is thinking about social justice as science fiction. Like that's how much we get to stretch our minds and like try new things. And we probably can't even conceive of what it looks like because we're all still so in it, and, you know, getting to decolonize our own minds and our systems as well. Yeah. So not to be out there with it, but just, it is actually like bring it down and drop it in and have it be very, very real, because it's what people experience on the daily.
Yeah, it's what people experience on the daily is the perfect place to end. Fleur, thank you so much for joining me. And thank you to you and everybody else. I feel like if I was going to have like the worst technology failure of the last 3 years, I'm glad that it happened with you, because I know that I can, you know, still be friends with you, and you're not going to, you're not going to like.
And I mean, I was laughing at the irony that like the woman of color has been silenced literally during this conversation.
Yeah.
Too funny. I'll just name that I have a white lady training coming up in November if anyone wants to send me their white ladies. Yeah.
And I can attest, I will just say, while it's contentious that white people are getting paid to do equity work, I think one piece of information that as an educator, both of us are trained as educators, we know is that we often learn best for people that look like us, which is not the reason to keep on keeping on with like hella white people in this work, but we do need white folks to learn from each other. And the folks that I've sent, to Fleur over the years, either they've really hated it and then it is what it is, but 80% of people have come out of that with like an aha moment that often as colleagues, we can't get our people there sometimes. It has to sometimes come from the outside. And so I highly, highly, highly recommend it. It is often a transformational experience, and you get to experience each other, white people, which thank you, Fleur, for holding space. And, you know, caring for your cousins. So thanks to you and thanks to everybody that joined. We'll pop in to register for your training in the chat on LinkedIn so folks can follow along. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Linda. Thanks, Parna. Have a good one.